Section 19. Signing, funding, recording, and possession. When is the deal really closed? We signed. Can we get the keys? Friday morning has arrived. Emily and Carlos walk into Maria's escrow office with identification in hand and enough nervous energy to power the entire building. They review the final documents. They ask questions. They sign, and sign, and sign some more. Finally, Carlos sends Sarah a text. We're done. Where do we get the keys? Sarah smiles. Then she types carefully. Congratulations on signing. Let me confirm the closing and possession status with escrow. That response may prevent a major mistake, because signing is not necessarily the same thing as being closed. Real estate has too many finish lines. Buyers hear several words during closing week: signing, consummation, funding, recording, close of escrow, possession. Agents sometimes use these terms as though they all mean exactly the same thing. They don't. That's especially important in Arizona, where buyers may sign documents and then immediately assume the house belongs to them and they can start moving furniture inside. Not so fast. Let's separate the events. What does TRID mean by consummation? Under Regulation Z, consummation occurs when the consumer becomes contractually obligated on the credit transaction under applicable law. Notice what that definition focuses on: the credit transaction. TRID's closing disclosure timing is tied to consummation of the mortgage credit transaction. It is not simply a federal definition for the buyer owns the Arizona house now. That's why agents should avoid treating every closing-related term as interchangeable. Sarah doesn't need to independently determine the exact legal instant of consummation. The lender and settlement professionals manage the lending and settlement process. Sarah needs to understand that the TRID clock and the Arizona real estate closing process are related but not identical concepts. Signing is a major step, but it isn't the whole process. Emily and Carlos have signed their documents. That's important, but several things may still need to occur. The lender may need to review the signed loan package. Funding conditions may need to be satisfied. Funds may need to be released. Escrow may need to confirm that all required funds and documents are available. Documents may need to be recorded. Only then may the transaction reach the contractual close of escrow event contemplated by the parties' agreement. So when Carlos says, "But we signed everything," Sarah shouldn't argue with him. She should explain, "Signing is an important step. Escrow still needs to complete the remaining closing process. I'll let you know as soon as we have confirmation." Then comes funding. In a finance transaction, the lender's money matters. Imagine Jason's lender reviews the signed package and discovers that one required document is missing. Funding is temporarily held. Emily calls Sarah. "But we already signed. Can the seller still give us the house?" The seller doesn't simply hand over the property because the buyer signed loan documents. The settlement process still needs to be completed. Sarah should communicate with Maria and Jason, determine what remains outstanding, and keep the buyer informed. She should not announce that the transaction has closed until she has appropriate confirmation. Then comes recording. Recording is another critical piece of the Arizona transaction. Documents affecting real property may be recorded with the appropriate county recorder. In a typical purchase transaction, the deed transferring the seller's interest to the buyer is part of the closing process. Carlos doesn't need a lecture on Arizona recording statutes while he's waiting for his keys. But Sarah needs to understand why Maria may say, "We're funded, but we're not recorded yet." Those are different milestones. But the moving truck is outside. Now let's make this realistic. It's 2:30 Friday afternoon. The moving truck is sitting in front of the Gilbert property. Carlos has 2 kids, a dog, a refrigerator full of groceries, and absolutely no patience left. He calls Sarah. "Escrow says we're still waiting for recording. The house is empty. Can you just give us the keys?" This is where an agent can create a serious problem by trying to be helpful. Sarah needs to look at the contract and follow the brokerage's procedures concerning possession and key release. If possession is tied to close of escrow or another specified event, she should not simply decide that the buyer can move in early. Premature possession creates risk. Imagine Sarah gives Carlos the keys before the agreed possession time. Carlos starts moving in. Then funding or recording is delayed until Monday. Now what? Who is responsible if Carlos damages the property? What if someone is injured? What if the seller's insurance is affected? What if the lender identifies a problem? What if the transaction never completes? What was intended as a nice favor can turn into a serious legal and brokerage problem. This is why experienced brokers are cautious about early possession. The contract controls possession. The buyer's excitement does not determine possession. The parties' agreement does. If Emily and Carlos are entitled to possession at the time established in the contract, Sarah should follow that agreement and her brokerage procedures. If the parties want to change possession, Don't handle it with, "Seller said it's probably fine." Document the appropriate agreement. This is especially important when possession is requested before closing or the seller wants to remain after closing. Those arrangements can create significant risks and should be handled using appropriate forms, broker guidance, and when necessary, legal advice. The call everyone is waiting for. At 4:06 p.m., Sarah's phone rings. It's Maria. We're recorded. Now Sarah can confirm the status under the transaction and follow the brokerage's procedures for key release and possession. She calls Emily. "We have confirmation. Congratulations." Emily screams. Carlos is already unloading the truck. Sarah laughs. This time, the celebration is appropriate. What would you do? Imagine you're the listing agent instead. The buyer's agent calls and says, "They signed this morning, so I gave them the lockbox code." You check with escrow. The transaction has it recorded. Your seller never authorized early possession. Do you have a problem? Potentially a very significant one. This is why agents should never use access tools, lockboxes, keys, or garage codes to casually create possession rights that aren't supported by the parties' agreement. Broker tip: wait for confirmation. Closing day creates pressure. Buyers want keys, sellers want proceeds, moving trucks are waiting, utilities are changing. Everyone wants an answer. Don't guess. Get confirmation from the appropriate escrow or settlement professional and review the contractual possession terms. Then act. One phone call can prevent an enormous problem. Chapter 4 comes together. Emily and Carlos have now moved from the closing disclosure through signing, funding, recording, and possession. We've learned that the 3-business-day closing disclosure rule protects the consumer before consummation. We've learned that not every corrected closing disclosure restarts that waiting period. We've learned that corrections can occur before and even after consummation. And we've learned that signing the paperwork does not automatically mean the buyer should receive the keys. But there's another side of TRID that Arizona agents need to understand. The closing disclosure contains more than loan information. It also contains real estate transaction information, commissions, seller paid costs, credits, prorations, and settlement figures. In Chapter 5, we're going to look at the closing disclosure from the real estate professional's perspective. Because sometimes the mortgage numbers are perfectly correct and the real estate numbers are wrong. Online Discussion 1. Emily and Carlos finish signing their loan and closing documents and immediately ask Sarah for the keys. Why should Sarah confirm the transaction status before releasing them? Signing is an important part of the transaction, but additional steps such as lender funding, satisfaction of closing conditions, and recording may still need to occur. Sarah should also review the contractual possession provisions and follow brokerage procedures. Releasing keys merely because the buyer signed could create unauthorized premature possession and substantial risk if the transaction has not completed. Escrow tells Sarah that the lender has funded, but the deed has not yet recorded. What should Sarah tell Carlos? Answer: Sarah should explain that funding and recording are separate milestones and that the closing process is still being completed. She should avoid representing the transaction as fully closed until she receives appropriate confirmation, and should follow the purchase contract and brokerage procedures concerning possession and key release. Why can allowing a buyer to move into the property before the agreed possession time create significant risk? Premature possession can create questions involving property damage, injuries, insurance, liability, utilities, access, and the party's rights if the transaction is delayed or fails to complete. An agent should not casually authorize possession outside the contract. Any proposed change should be handled through the appropriate agreement and broker guidance.